Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
I hope everyone had a great Christmas and enjoyed time with family and friends over the last few days. This week we're featuring an Ask the Expert interview from Farm Science Review. Michael Langemeier from Purdue University is interviewed by David Marrison. David's an extension educator in Coshocton County. They provide really good advice on building a strong relationship between tenants and landowners, which is especially important when transitioning to the next generation. Enjoy.
Dr. Michael Langemeier from Purdue University, and I can say boiler up because I'm an alumni, so that is good. I think that's why Chris allows me to do, well, I get to interview you once, and then we're going to shift gears here, but we're going to switch interviewers to keep you fresh as we go. So, traveled over from West Lafayette today, and we are asking, you're actually the only speaker to go back-to-back this year. So you got a tough chore. That's why we're going to have to switch moderators on you. But we want to talk about something that's pretty important. I know our legal folks will say that, but also with the competitive nature of different land leases that are out there, we want to talk about quality leases that will help your farm and operation. So let's start off with these farm leases and that communication process.
Yeah, communication is extremely important, and I think operators are doing a much better job than they probably used to.
Can you hear okay?
It's more challenging today for operators.
Here, pull it down a little bit.
Here?
Perfect. Now we're good. Boiler up.
It's more challenging. It's certainly more challenging for operators because they have a lot of landlords, and some of the landlords don't live very close, so it makes it a little more challenging. But there's things you can do. Communicate via the internet, communicate via newsletter, but most landlords want to know how the farm is doing. They want to know things like, oh, well, I got a big rain, and the crop looks good, and so on. And so I think this communication is extremely important in today's environment. But obviously, Barry Ward talked about the tight margins we've had since 2013. Obviously, you also want to talk about what's happening in production agriculture. You know, some landlords don't really pay much attention to what corn prices and soybean prices are.
And they don't know all these discussions with China, right?
They don't talk to you and Chris Hurt and myself and others all the time and listen to all of this. And so just informing them of what's going on in production agriculture and indicating that, well, the net return to land is not as good as it was 5 years ago by any stretch of the imagination. So there's going to be downward pressure on cash rent. And if you're in a share rent situation, it's going to be lower. Certainly, nobody wants to be shocked, and so communication is just very, very important.
So you're talking about communication. How often should we communicate as a landlord and tenant?
That's going to vary. That's going to vary by landlord, but most of the leasing publications suggest at least 2 or 3 times a year. Obviously, when you're renewing the lease, that's an important time. Also, when you're talking about the crop at the end of the year, that's an important time. But I think at least once during the growing season, you should communicate how the crop is doing, and regardless of whether it's a cash rent or a share rent. If it's a cash rent, a lot of landlords would like to know. What's going on in their land, what the crop looks like, and so on.
Yeah, because here in Ohio, the conversation about the crop conditions very different. The discussions we're having at the end of May and June to the discussions that we could have here in August and September.
Oh, definitely.
It changed a lot during that growing season.
A lot, and part of why I think this topic is so important is I worked for a while when I was a college student as a farm management intern. And so one of the things I did for this farm management company is we would scout fields, and they would communicate at least once a month with these landlords. And so and the landlords we worked with really appreciated that. And that was back in the days when there was more share rent arrangements, but there were some cash rent arrangements in that group. And to the landlord, all of them appreciated knowing what was going on in that ground and how things were going.
Now, I heard you talk before about the need for year-end reports. Can you talk a little bit about that? And
Again,
Are those important? What's in it?
This would be regardless whether it's a cash rent or share rent. I think just a summary of the crops that were planted. What were the yields? Even a cash rent.
We're going to tell them what the yields were? They may jack the rent up.
Even a cash rent landlord, tell them what the yields are. But it goes the other direction, too. Sometimes the yields are not as good as the trend yield. Talk about production notes. What were some of the issues, particularly if there's drainage issues? That needs to be communicated at least once a year, that we have drainage areas in particular areas of the field, and be proactive on that. Maybe there's a chance to put some tile in. So start that discussion. Certainly plans for next year. What kind of crops are they looking at for next year?
Yeah, when they look out their window, are they going to see corn, beans, or wheat? What are they going to look at, actually?
Yes. And then, and certainly if it's a crop share, it needs to be a very detailed summary of the shares. For example, if they're sharing seed, fertilizer, and herbicide and insecticide, very detailed information about the type of fertilizers are put on, the type of herbicides were used, the type of seed that was used, and what that cost total, and then what the share is for the landowner. So be very transparent on that. You don't want to lose a landlord because you didn't communicate that. You just said, well, you owe me $50. And so making sure there's a detailed summary regarding the crop shares. And then Barry earlier talked about flex rent leases. If you're in a flex rent lease, which we can talk about a little bit more, but if you're in a flex rent lease, it's extremely important to define the formula. One of the problems of some cash rent landlords going to flex cash rent is if it's not communicated exactly how that's calculated, you could really cause some landlords to be angry because they look at that and say, well, I don't understand why I'm getting 80% of what I got last year, because a lot of times the flex rents are set up that they're 80 or 90% of a base cash rent, and then you only get another additional payment if revenue is very high, if revenue is above cost. Diane was talking about costs here before. If revenue is above cost, then what typically happens is the revenue is shared. That revenue above cost is shared between the landlord and the tenant. And so all of that needs to be laid out when you're doing a flex rent. What is the base? How is that decided? But more importantly, if it's based on if the bonus is based on revenue, how is that bonus calculated? How are we going to validate the yields? Where do we get the price? Is the price the December price for the state of Ohio from USDA NAS? Is it a first week in December price from elevator XYZ? Where are we getting the price? And so be very, very specific about that formula. I think flex rents, it's a very good time to think about flex rents because it's a way to try to negotiate the cash rents down a little bit lower. But tell the landowner that if corn and soybean prices increase dramatically, or if we have very good yields like we did across the Corn Belt this year, there's a chance for a bonus. Now,
what's your gut? What do you think of the number of tenant farmers that actually provide this to the landlords that they're renting from? Maybe Indiana is different than Ohio, but I have a gut feel here.
The end of the year report is not very common. But it's another way to have good relations with the landlord. I don't know how many lease meetings I go to, and I'm sure the Ohio State people, it's the same way. If you do lease meetings, David, would be the same for you, where a landlord will come up to me and, do I have a right to know what the yields are? And I just about fall off my chair.
Or what the soil test says when they take a soil test.
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course you have a right to understand that information. So in most of my lease presentations, I talk about this end of the year report. That the fact, regardless of what the rental arrangement is, just basically telling some key information about what went on each tract.
And that just improves the relationship between the landlord and the tenant farmer.
Definitely.
So that's a great segue. Are there other things that we can do as we're building this relationship, especially in these farm transitions that we look at? We have been used to working with mom and dad of a certain family, but all of a sudden mom and dad aren't there, and now we got 3 snotty-nosed kids that may live in Ohio, Indiana, and maybe Texas, and they're dealing with 3 new people. So
the end of the year report's even more important as the people that inherited the ground are further and further away from the land. Because you're just providing some basic information of what's going on out there, and quite often the younger generation is just as interested, if not more interested, than the previous generation in that end of year report. And so definitely that's very important to communicate with the new heirs.
So other things that if we're going out and maybe trying to get some new land, are there some key things that we need to consider?
Well, if you're working with a new landowner, this is like any other relationships. You have to communicate. You have to communicate and talk about why you're a good fit to farm that ground. It may sound kind of quaint, but why you're a good fit to farm that ground, and talk about what your plans are for crops. Talk about what the potential yields might be. Talk. Certainly, if it's a crop share, you need to get much more detailed on how that's going to work and what your plan is in terms of seeding rates and what the seed costs, what's going to cost. Seed cost per acre, and give them some idea before the bill comes in on what the cost is going to be there, and so just building that relationship by trying to really communicate well with the landowner or landowners. Some of these cases might be 6 landowners. There was one before, now there's 6.
Especially with the LLCs that we have nowadays.
And so you got to figure out who's the key person to communicate with there, and what. And how often should you communicate? You probably should ask them. How often do you want to get a report? Because as I indicated, when I was working with a farm management company in Fremont, Nebraska, it was once a month. That was kind of the expectation there. My nephew's working for that same firm, and they still do that, by the way. But also, ask questions. If you're the operator and you've got this new landowner, ask questions about the history of the land. If it's particularly if that landowner used to farm the ground, they're always interested in talking about that. That's part of building that relationship, because that person might have farmed that ground for a lot of years. They know everything about that ground. They know
every wet spot,
where the yields are really good,
low
where the yields are really
spots.
poor, where the drainage is a problem, where it might be weedy spots. They know all of that stuff, and so ask a lot of questions about the history of the land. Ask about prior lease arrangements and how those worked. Did they switch 20 years ago from share to cash rent? Did they like that? Would they consider switching back? This wouldn't be a bad time to maybe have a share rent lease with landowners rather than the cash rent lease. That's probably a tough sell. And then ask about expectations, and that goes back to what kind of information do you want to know, and how frequently do you want to know that information. So ask about their expectations, and then check in very frequently. More than 2 or 3 times
especially
a year.
When it's a new relationship, as you're cultivating
it's a new
that.
landowner, because you're cultivating that. And even though today there's probably not 10 people waiting to farm the ground that you're starting to farm, there still might be 1 or 2. And I think that was brought up earlier too. There might be 1 or 2 farms in the county that are looking to farm that ground. So you want to start off very positive and show that you're a professional and you're going to communicate frequently and tell them what's going on.
Now, on the flip side, we have some landlords that might listen to the podcast later. So what should some of the things that landlords are asking?
Well, it's the same with building that relationship. I mean, don't be afraid to ask questions about production practices, about yields. Don't be afraid to ask questions about those things. You don't want to dictate what they're going to do. You don't want to say, well, I don't think continuous soybeans is a good idea. You shouldn't do that. If you're a cash rent landowner, they make the cropping decisions, but ask questions about that.
Well, we've had some landowners asking, "Are you using that new dicamba stuff?"
Yes.
They want to know that.
Yeah. And so if they want to know, ask the questions. It doesn't hurt to ask the questions, and usually the operator will gladly answer those questions, but they can't answer questions that are not asked. That's pretty obvious, and so I think that's a very important. Also, state expectations. It goes the same the other direction. What are your expectations of me as the operator? How frequently we communicate and so on. And if they want if they want the road ditch mowed, tell me that. Tell me.
They want snow plowed in the wintertime. Tell me that.
Tell me how often the previous tenant did that, and what's your expectation there, and we can negotiate the cash rent accordingly with that. So that shouldn't be a problem. But the key point here is, and this goes back to the questions I get at the meetings I go to. The landowners are there. Don't be afraid to ask questions. It's your land. It's your asset. You have a right to know what's going on that ground.
And I feel a lot of maybe landlords don't sometimes feel held hostage by the tenant farmer, and
Well,
they're afraid to ask
they
those
think
questions.
they're cash rent landowners, so I really don't have a right to make decisions, and technically you shouldn't dictate what's going on there if you're a cash rent landlord, but you certainly should know what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So if we get in some of these arrangements where we share some of these lease agreements, what's fair, what's equitable, what kind of things should we be looking at in those lease arrangements?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure I had time to talk about what a fair and equitable income sharing arrangement is. We talk a lot about this in farm management books, and it sounds like a mouthful, but it's really quite straightforward. And this goes back particularly for share rents, but also for flex rent arrangements where there's more sharing going on, sharing a bonus in the flex rent case, sharing of the income in the share rent situation. And I'm just going to quote here directly. Fair and equitable sharing arrangement exists when both parties are paid for the use of their inputs according to the contribution those inputs make toward generating revenue. Let's give a very specific example here. This is an example from Indiana, so you can tell me if we need to shift the percentages a little bit. In Indiana, approximately, if you have a corn-soybean rotation, approximately a third of the costs are land costs. And so if you didn't share any inputs and you shared the crop, an fair and equitable leasing arrangement would be 2/3 to the operator and 1/3 to the landlord, because the landlord's providing a third of the cost. If
Sound equitable? About the same? I've never heard them use their sirens on their little things like that.
Would that percentage be about the same, Barry? Third? Now, if the landlord's also providing seed, fertilizer, and herbicides in Indiana, that share would go up to 50%.
Okay.
That would go up to 50%. Now, that might be a little bit lower in places. Yeah, I've seen that a little bit lower back where I'm from, and in the western Great Plains. But if you're on good soil, the 50% is a fair and equitable arrangement. And one of the things that I've done, and let me talk a little bit more about flex rent if I can.
Okay, great.
I know that was talked about previously, but let me talk a little bit more about that. What I've done with some analysis is I've compared share rent arrangement that's 50%, 50-50, sharing seed, fertilizer, and herbicide. I've compared that with cash rent to the flex rent. And what I tried to do is I tried to come up with terms, reasonable flex rent terms that would give you similar income to the share rent arrangement and the cash rent arrangement. And what we found works for us, because sometimes people need an example to go with, is an 80% base. And so you have the base is 80% of the current market cash rent. So you need to know what the current cash rent is, and then calculate cost based on a budget, Ohio State budget or a Purdue budget. Just use something that's very transparent, and then look at the non-land costs, all the non-land costs, and see if the revenue is above the non-land cost plus the base in any given year. That we haven't seen that for a while, but certainly back from 2007 to 2013, there was a lot of years during that period where the revenue was above those things. If the revenue is above those non-land costs plus the base rent, then share the revenue 50-50.
Okay, and share it 50-50 above that.
Yeah.
Great.
And the reason I kind of like that in today's environment is there's so much uncertainty what the price is going to be, particularly for soybeans. I mean, I know you've talked about that a lot the last 2 days. Ben was, I heard Ben. Chris Hurt probably went on and on yesterday about that.
Oh, they're like equal.
Yeah.
You thought you were listening to each other when you were listening to them. Same message.
Same message. But when there's so much uncertainty like this, I think flex rent makes sense, because there is a chance if we get this settled that prices could go up rather substantially, and maybe a year or two we could get in a situation where there might be some revenue to share. But certainly the flex rent would give some flexibility to the operator for the next year or two. Next year or two, during these times where soybean price, I think the WASDE price range is $735 to $985, something like that. That's unbelievable. You stop to think about it, and then we have the wide basis on top of that, and so I think flex rent arrangements make a lot of sense in today. But again, going back to something I talked about earlier, we need to make sure that if we're going to do a flex rent, that we're very transparent how the formulas are defined.
And how we report
you
back.
You do not want to
especially.
lose you don't want to ruin a relationship because the terms were not well defined.
And it may ruin that relationship for a share arrangement for the next person, the next generation, regardless. So, question on, you want to stump the Purdue?
That would not be hard to do.
Barry?
Well, certainly have the discussion with the landlord, and sometimes landlords are willing to share that expense, and so certainly that's a possibility. They don't necessarily want to pay for 100%. There's a reason why the ground's not tiled, because it's expensive. But certainly ask them about sharing the expenses, and then once you've kind of got a commitment from them whether they're going to share the expense or not, then what I recommend is negotiating a long-term lease. I think that's a pretty standard recommendation, and a little lower, of course, because you're paying for part of that tile. But certainly because you're going to be paying for that tile for a long period of time, you want to have a longer lease. That's extremely important. And in Indiana, we have a lot of one-year leases, and so certainly you would like a 5 to 10 year lease. And I've talked to quite a few operators that have been successful doing that, and it's worth it. 5 to 7. Yeah, 3 to 5 is really not long enough. You'd like to get closer to that 7. Yeah. 15. I think that a lot of our landlords wouldn't go for that, but you probably 7 to 10. Yeah.
Transparency is so key in a landowner-tenant relationship, especially in a market as volatile as crops can be. So if you'd like more information on different types of leases or example leases, go to farmoffice.osu.edu or aglease101.org. We'll be back after the first of the year talking about some of the research trials featured in the 2018 eField report, which will be released on January 9th. Don't forget to sign up for Precision University. It's on that same date, January 9th. You need to sign up by January 2nd. Go to go.osu.edu/PrecisionU. For our female listeners, we'd love to have you join us for a weekend retreat focused on farm management. Annie's project will be held January 11th through the 13th in Logan County. Find a link in the episode description to that brochure, and also remember to check out the Ohio Ag Manager website for a list of the 2019 Outlook meetings. From us here at the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast, have a happy and safe New Year.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.